You waited. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Silence so loud it made you question your worth. And then one day they come back. No warning, no explanation, just presence. But here's what nobody tells you when an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence. It's not random, it's not casual, and it's definitely not meaningless. Something has already shifted inside them. And if you don't understand what's happening in that moment, you might lose control of the outcome. One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with an avoidant is taking their silence personally. When someone pulls away, stops responding, or disappears without explanation, the natural reaction is to internalize it. You start questioning yourself. Was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Was I not enough for them to stay? That spiral of self-doubt can be overwhelming, and it feels real. But the truth is, their silence was never really about you. It was about what they felt inside and didn't know how to handle. Avoidant individuals are not wired in the same way when it comes to emotional closeness. Where most people see connection as something comforting, they often experience it as something internal, tense, overwhelming, and even threatening. It's not that they don't feel emotions in many cases. They feel deeply. But instead of leaning into those feelings, they instinctively move away from them. Emotional intimacy triggers a kind of internal pressure they don't know how to regulate. So, when things start getting real, when the connection deepens, when vulnerability increases, that's when their system tells them to create distance. This is why their silence can feel so confusing. One moment, everything seems fine. There's chemistry, connection, maybe even consistency, and then suddenly they withdraw. No clear reason, no proper explanation. It feels abrupt and unfair. But what's happening internally for them is not sudden at all. It's a build-up, a slow rise of emotional discomfort that reaches a point where they feel the need to escape just to regain a sense of control. You have to understand that their withdrawal is a coping mechanism, not a calculated rejection. They're not sitting there thinking about how to hurt you or how to make you feel small. In fact, many avoidants avoid confrontation altogether. Instead of expressing what they're feeling or communicating their need for space, they choose silence because it feels safer than vulnerability. Silence doesn't require explanation. Silence doesn't expose their emotions. It allows them to retreat without facing the discomfort of being seen too deeply. The problem is, on the receiving end, silence feels like abandonment. It feels like being left without closure, without clarity, without respect. And because there's no communication, your mind fills in the gaps. You create stories to make sense of what happened, and most of those stories turn inward. You blame yourself because it's easier to believe you did something wrong than to accept that someone else is struggling with something you can't control. But their silence is not a reflection of your value. It doesn't measure your worth, your attractiveness, or your ability to be loved. It reflects their capacity to handle emotional closeness, and at that moment, their capacity was limited. That limitation existed before you, and it will likely exist after you unless clears throat, they consciously work on it. What makes this dynamic even more painful is that avoidants often don't communicate this clearly. They won't say, "I'm overwhelmed," or "I need space," because this is getting too intense for me. Instead, they just disappear or become distant, and that lack of communication can feel like emotional negligence. But again, it comes back to their discomfort with vulnerability. Admitting they're overwhelmed requires them to acknowledge emotions they've spent a long time suppressing. It's important to recognize that you cannot fix this by trying harder, loving more, or proving your worth. Fact, the more you chase, the more you try to close the gap they created, the more pressure they feel. And pressure is exactly what triggered their withdrawal in the first place. So what ends up happening is a cycle of distance, pursuit, more distance. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse the behavior or accept being treated poorly. It simply means you stop misinterpreting it. You stop turning their silence into a personal failure, because once you do that, you regain something powerful you feel of self. Instead of asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" you start asking, "Why am I trying to be enough for someone who can't even meet me emotionally?" That shift changes everything. It moves you out of a place of insecurity and into a place of awareness. At the end of the day, their silence says more about their internal struggles than it ever will about your value. You can be understanding without losing yourself in the process. You can recognize their patterns without making them your responsibility. And most importantly, you can choose not to let someone else's inability to handle closeness define how you see yourself. One of the most misunderstood parts of dealing with an avoidant is the assumption that when they go silent, they simply move on and forget. From the outside, it looks that way. No messages, no calls, no visible effort to reconnect. It feels like you've been erased. And naturally, your mind starts filling in the blanks with painful conclusions they never cared. It meant nothing to them, or they replaced me easily. But what you don't see is the internal world they retreat into, because just because they are silent doesn't mean they are empty. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time the way others might. Instead of expressing what they feel as it happens, they suppress it, delay it, or push it aside. But emotions don't just disappear because they're ignored. They stay, they build, and they resurface later, often in silence. So when an avoidant pulls away, it's not the end of their emotional experience with you. In many cases, it's the beginning of them actually confronting those emotions, just in a way that is hidden and internal. In that silence, they replay moments, conversations you had, the way you made them feel, the comfort, the connection, even the intensity that once overwhelmed them. But instead of reaching out and expressing that, they analyze it privately. They try to make sense of their own reactions. Why did this feel so strong? Why did it make me uncomfortable? Why did I feel the need to pull away? These are not questions they usually ask out loud, but internally they are very real. The difference is they don't process these thoughts with the intention of immediate action. While someone else might feel something and want to fix it, talk about it, or reconnect, an avoidant tends to sit with it. They create distance not just physically but emotionally as a way to regulate themselves. And in that space, thinking becomes safer than feeling, and remembering becomes easier than re-engaging. What makes this confusing is the contradiction. They can think about you often, miscertification, aim aspects of the connection and still not reach out. To most people, missing someone leads to action. But for an avoidant, missing someone can actually intensify the internal conflict, because missing you means acknowledging attachment, and attachment is exactly what triggers their discomfort. So instead of moving towards you, they sometimes stay away even longer, trying to quiet that feeling rather than act on it. This is why their silence can feel so final, even when it's not. It's not that they've forgotten, it's that they're stuck in a loop of thinking without expressing. They might wonder what you're doing, whether you've moved on, whether things could have been different. They might even feel regret. But those thoughts often stay locked inside because acting on them would require vulnerability. And vulnerability is what they've learned to avoid. Another layer to this is pride and self-protection. Once they've created distance, reaching out again can feel like losing control. It means facing the emotions they tried to escape, and it also means risking rejection or emotional exposure. So even if they think about you, even if they feel something, they may convince themselves to stay silent because it feels safer than opening that door again. From your perspective, this creates a painful illusion. You see silence and interpret it as indifference. You assume that if they cared, they would say something, and in many situations that's a reasonable expectation. But with avoidance, care doesn't always translate into action. Their internal world can be active while their external behavior remains still. This doesn't mean you should wait around or hold on to hope based on what they might be thinking. Their thoughts, no matter how real, don't change your reality if they're not communicated. What matters is what is shown, not what is hidden. But understanding that they do think about you can help you detach from the idea that you were meaningless. You are not easily forgotten. You are experienced, felt, and remembered, just not expressed in the way you expected or deserved. And that distinction is important because it helps you separate your value from their behavior. At the same time, it's important to stay grounded. Thinking about someone is not the same as showing up for them. Replaying memories is not the same as building something real. An internal reference, action, while meaningful, doesn't replace communication or effort. So while it may be true that they think about you in the silence, that alone is not enough to sustain a connection. What this really reveals is the gap between feeling and action. Avoidance can feel deeply but struggle to act on those feelings in a consistent, healthy way. And unless they actively work on that pattern, it tends to repeat silence, reflection, return, and then distance again. Understanding this gives you clarity. It allows you to stop chasing answers that may never be spoken, and to stop assuming that silence equals lack of care. But more importantly, it reminds you that you deserve more than being thought about in private. You deserve to be chosen, expressed, and valued out loud, not just remembered in silence. When an avoidant comes back after a period of silence, it's easy to assume it was a simple decision, like they just woke up one day, felt like reaching out, and did it. But that's not how it works. For an avoidant, coming back is rarely impulsive or effortless. It's usually the result of an internal struggle that has been building over time. A quiet but intense conflict between two opposing forces, RCEs inside them, the need for connection and the fear of it. On one side, there is the part of them that felt something real with you. That part remembers the comfort, the familiarity, the way you understood them in a way others didn't. It holds on to moments that made them feel seen, even if they didn't fully express it at the time. That side of them doesn't just disappear when they pull away. It stays, even in silence, quietly reminding them that what they experienced mattered. But on the other side, there is fear. Not always obvious fear. Not always something they can even clearly explain, but a deep discomfort with emotional closeness. It can show up as a need for space, a desire to stay in control, or a resistance to anything that feels too intense or demanding. This fear often wins in the moment, which is why they leave. It pushes them to create distance, convincing them that being alone or detached is safer than being emotionally involved. So when they're gone, they're not just forgetting you, they're navigating this internal tension. Part of them feels relief in the distance because it reduces the emotional pressure, but another part of them starts to notice the absence, the quiet where your presence used to be. And that absence doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings reflection. Over time, the balance can start to shift. The initial relief they felt from pulling away may fade, and what's left is a sense of something unfinished. They might start questioning their decision. They might replay the connection, wondering if they left too quickly, if they misunderstood their own feelings, or if they pushed away something that could have been meaningful. This doesn't happen instantly. It's a gradual process, often happening beneath the surface. At the same time, their fear doesn't disappear. That's what makes this so complex. Even as they begin to feel the pull to reconnect, the hesitation is still there. They may think about reaching out, then stop themselves. They may draft a message in their mind, then decide not to send it. There's a back and forth happening internally that you never see. One moment they lean toward connection, the next they retreat into caution. This push and pull can go on for a long time before they actually take action. And when they finally do, it's not because the fear is gone, it's because something else became strong, even if only for a moment. That something could be curiosity, missing the connection, or simply the realization that staying silent hasn't brought them the clarity or peace they expected. So when they reach out, it's not a casual move. It represents a moment where they chose to step slightly outside their comfort zone. It may not look like a big deal on the surface, a simple message, a small gesture, but for them, it can carry a lot of weight. It means they've crossed a line they usually avoid, even if they don't fully show it. However, it's important not to romanticize this moment too much. Yes, it takes internal conflict for them to come back, but that doesn't mean they've resolved that conflict. The same fears, the same patterns, the same discomfort with closeness are often still there. Their return doesn't automatically signal growth or change. It simply shows that in that moment, their desire to reconnect outweighed their urge to stay distant. This is where many people misunderstand the situation. They see the return as a sign that everything will be different now, that the avoidant has realized their mistake and is ready to fully engage. But in reality, the internal battle, is usually ongoing. Coming back is just one step in that cycle, not the end of it. Understanding this helps you stay grounded. It allows you to recognize that their return is not just about you, it's about what's happening inside them. It's about their struggle to balance connection and self-protection. And while that struggle may bring them back into your life, it doesn't guarantee consistency, clarity, or emotional availability. What it does show is that the connection had an impact. It mattered enough to create that internal conflict to stay in their thoughts to eventually pull them back. But impact alone isn't enough to build something stable. Without awareness and effort on their part, the same patterns can repeat because the root of the conflict hasn't been fully addressed. So when they come back, it's not just a return, it's a reflection of everything they've been wrestling with internally. It's a sign that, at least for a moment, they chose to face what they usually avoid. And while that moment is real, it's only meaningful in what comes next, not just in the act of coming back itself. When an avoidant comes back into your life after a period of silence, it rarely happens. Pens with full emotional clarity or immediate openness. What you experience in that moment is often not a full return of commitment, but something far more cautious and controlled. They don't jump back into the depths of the connection right away. Instead, they test the space between you. They observe, they assess, and they move slowly, almost as if they are checking whether it is safe to even exist in your emotional world again. This behavior is not random. It comes from their internal wiring, where emotional closeness is something that feels both desired and threatening at the same time. So, when they reappear, they don't immediately surrender to the connection. That would feel too overwhelming. Instead, they take small steps, a message here, a casual check-in there, a light conversation that avoids anything too emotionally intense. It may even feel confusing to you because you are expecting depth, honesty, or at least clarity, but what you get first is distance disguised as interaction. From their perspective, this approach makes sense. They are not trying to deceive you or play games in a conscious way. They are trying to regain a sense of emotional balance after a period of withdrawal. Stepping directly back into deep emotional exchange would feel like jumping into cold water without knowing the temperature. So instead, they dip their toes in. They look for signs. How do you respond? Are you upset? Have things changed? Is the emotional pressure still there, or has it softened? Every interaction becomes a form of data collection for them. Your tone, your availability, your emotional energy, all of it is being observed, even if you are not aware of it. They are trying to answer an unspoken question. Can I be here without losing myself again? And until they feel somewhat reassured, they will not move toward depth. They will stay on the surface, where things feel safer and more manageable. This is why their return often feels inconsistent. One moment they seem engaged, the next they pull back slightly. It is not necessarily because they are unsure about you as a person, but because they are unsure about the emotional environment they are stepping back into. Depth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust, not just in you, but in themselves and their ability to handle emotional closeness without retreating again. What makes this even more challenging is that from your side, it can feel like progress. You see them coming back, initiating contact, showing interest in some form, and naturally, you start to believe that things are moving forward. But in reality, they may still be in the testing phase, not the committing phase. And that gap between perception and reality is where a lot of emotional confusion happens. They might engage in conversations that feel meaningful, but avoid topics that would truly deepen the connection. They might show consistency for a short period and then suddenly become distant again. This push and pull is not always a sign of manipulation. It is often a reflection of internal hesitation. They are trying to stay close enough to not lose you completely, but distant enough to not feel overwhelmed. The deeper truth is that avoidants often struggle with emotional pacing. They don't naturally move from silence to full emotional engagement in a smooth transition. Instead, they move in steps, and sometimes those steps are uneven. They can be present without being fully present. They can communicate without fully opening up, and they can care without fully expressing that care in a way that feels secure, you to the other person. This is why patience alone is not always enough in these situations, because what is required is not just waiting, but understanding what stage the interaction is actually in. If you misinterpret testing as commitment, you will invest emotionally at a level they are not yet ready to match, and that imbalance can lead to disappointment, frustration, or emotional exhaustion. At the same time, it is important to recognize that their testing phase is not something you can control. You cannot rush them into depth by giving more, explaining more, or proving more. In fact, too much emotional intensity too soon can have the opposite effect. It can reinforce their fear and cause them to retreat again. Their system needs gradual safety, not emotional acceleration. However, there is also a key truth on your side of the experience. While they are testing you, you are also being revealed to yourself. This phase shows you how they handle closeness, but it also shows you how you respond to uncertainty. Do you abandon your own emotional boundaries to keep them close? Do you overextend yourself trying to secure their attention? Chaz. Or do you remain grounded, observing the IR behavior without losing your own center? Because ultimately, this dynamic is not just about whether they are testing you. It is also about whether you are willing to accept inconsistency in the name of potential connection, and that is where awareness becomes powerful. When you understand that they are in a testing phase, you stop mistaking uncertainty for stability. You stop building emotional certainty on temporary behavior. The reality is that depth cannot be forced and it cannot be rushed. If it is going to happen with an avoidant, it will only happen when their internal sense of safety catches up with the external connection. Until then, you are likely to experience surface-level engagement mixed with emotional hesitation. And that is the core of this stage. They are not yet diving into you. They are still deciding if the water is safe enough to enter fully. When an avoidant reappears after silence, the moment feels emotionally charged for both sides. But what happens next is often decided less by their actions and more by your response. This is where many people unknowingly lose their emotional balance. Not because they do something wrong in a dramatic sense, but because they react from a place of emotional urgency instead of grounded self-awareness. In these moments, your reaction becomes the most influential factor in shaping the direction of whatever comes next. From your perspective, the return can feel like relief, confusion, excitement, or even validation. After days, weeks, or months of silence, seeing them come back naturally triggers emotional momentum. You might want answers immediately. You might want clarity about why they left, what they were thinking, and what their return means. You might also feel a strong urge to reconnect quickly, to rebuild what was lost, or to ensure they don't disappear again. All of these reactions are deeply human, especially when emotional attachment is involved. However, from the avoidance perspective, your reaction becomes a form of emotional data, not in a calculated or manipulative way, but in a way that helps them decide whether it feels safe to continue engaging or whether it feels overwhelming again. They are not just observing your words, they are observing your emotional intensity, your level of pressure, your tone, your patience, and your ability to remain stable in a situation that is emotionally uncertain. If your reaction is highly emotional, intense, or demanding of immediate clarity, it can unconsciously trigger their withdrawal system. Not because your emotions are wrong, but because emotional intensity can feel like pressure to someone who already struggles with emotional closeness. In their internal experience, pressure often translates into a need to step back, even if the connection itself is meaningful to them. On the other hand, if your reaction is calm, grounded, and self-respecting, it creates a very different emotional signal. It communicates stability. It shows that while you are open to connection, you are not emotionally dependent on their presence or absence. And that distinction is extremely important in dynamics involving avoidant behavior. Because what often draws them in is not pursuit, but emotional safety. This doesn't mean you suppress your feelings or act indifferent. It means you stop letting your emotions dictate impulsive responses that may later create imbalance. You can acknowledge their return without immediately trying to define it. You can engage without over-investing. You can observe without over-analyzing every small interaction. Had emotional steadiness is what creates a different kind of dynamic, one where you are not chasing clarity, but allowing behavior to reveal itself over time. When you stay grounded, something important shifts in the interaction. The pressure that usually builds in early reconnection phases is reduced. Instead of feeling like they're stepping into emotional urgency, they experience space. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, space often feels safer than pressure. That safety does not automatically create commitment, but it does create the possibility of continued interaction without immediate withdrawal. This is where emotional control becomes powerful, not as a tool to influence them, but as a way to protect yourself from emotional instability. Because when you react from anxiety or fear of loss, you unintentionally place your emotional state in their hands. Their response dictates your mood. Their silence creates your confusion. Their presence becomes your relief. And over time, this imbalance can become emotionally exhausting. But when you remain centered, you shift that structure. You begin to respond instead of react. You allow space between what you feel and what you express. You don't rush into conclusions based on early behavior. You observe consistency over time instead of emotional spikes in the moment. And that patience protects you from misinterpreting temporary engagement as long-term stability. It is also important to understand that your reaction teaches them how the connection will function moving forward. If your response is rooted in urgency, they may associate the connection with emotional intensity they are not ready to handle. If your response is balanced, they may begin to associate the connection with calmness and predictability. Neither outcome guarantees permanence, but it does shape the emotional environment between you. At the same time, this is not about performing emotional control to win someone back or to keep them engaged. That approach itself becomes another form of pressure. The real shift happens when your reaction is no longer driven by the fear of losing them, but by the awareness of your own emotional value. You are not trying to secure their presence, you are simply not abandoning yourself in the process of their return. This is the point where many people either regain emotional clarity or lose it again. See, when someone reappears after silence, it can feel like a second chance. But if that second chance is handled from the same emotional patterns as before, chasing, over-explaining, over-giving, it often leads back to the same cycle. The return does not change the dynamic by itself. Your response to it plays a major role in what the dynamic becomes. So the real power in this moment is not in controlling them, but in controlling your own emotional pace. It is in not rushing to fill the silence they created. It is in not forcing immediate answers to questions that time will naturally reveal. And it is in recognizing that stability is not proven by how quickly you reconnect, but by how well you can stay grounded when connection becomes uncertain again. Because ultimately, when an avoidant returns, they are not just evaluating whether they want to stay connected, they are also responding to the emotional environment they step back into. And your reaction is a major part of that environment, shaping whether the interaction moves toward calm understanding or back into emotional distance. There comes a point in this kind of dynamic where the focus quietly shifts away from them and comes back to you, even if you don't immediately realize it. When someone disappears and reappears in your life, especially someone who struggles with emotional closeness, it can start to feel like your emotional world is built around their timing. Their silence becomes a waiting period. Their return becomes a signal. Their attention becomes a reward. And slowly, without noticing it, your sense of stability starts depending on something outside of your control. But the deeper truth is that every time an avoidant steps away and comes back, it creates a moment of clarity for you, even if it feels uncomfortable. It forces you to confront something important. You are not the same person you were when the silence began. You have lived through uncertainty. You have processed confusion, emotional distance, and unanswered questions. You have felt the absence of someone who mattered to you, and you have survived it. That experience changes you, whether you acknowledge it immediately or not. What most people don't realize is that emotional absence has a way of reshaping identity. In the beginning, you may have been focused on them, what they are thinking, why they left, whether they will return. But over time, that focus starts to reveal something about you. Your patience, your emotional limits, your attachment style, your boundaries, and your capacity to sit with uncertainty all come into view. The silence becomes less about them and more about how you respond to being in a space where clarity is missing. So when they come back, it can feel like everything resets. But internally, nothing resets. You are not the same person who was waiting before. You have already experienced their absence. You have already felt what it is like to be without explanation, without consistency, without emotional security. That experience leaves a mark, even if you still feel attached. And that mark is what creates the possibility of change within you. This is where the real shift happens. Because their return is not just about their behavior, it becomes a mirror for your growth. It shows you whether you still accept the same emotional uncertainty or whether something inside you has started to resist it. It shows you whether you still prioritize potential over consistency or whether you now recognize the importance of emotional stability over emotional intensity. When you are in the middle, E of attachment, it is easy to confuse emotional highs and lows with connection. The moments when they are close feel powerful. The moments when they disappear feel painful. That contrast can create a strong emotional pull. But over time, you begin to see that intensity is not the same as security. Someone coming and going from your life does not create stability, even if the feelings involved are real. And this is where your power starts to form, not in how you respond to them, but in how you respond to yourself. Do you abandon your own emotional needs just to keep access to someone who is inconsistent? Do you ignore the discomfort you feel in the silence just to preserve the possibility of their return? Or do you start recognizing that emotional consistency is not a luxury, but a necessity for your well-being? The most important realization in this process is that you are allowed to outgrow emotional patterns that once felt normal. You are allowed to stop seeing inconsistency as something you need to adapt to. You are allowed to question whether waiting, guessing, and hoping should be part of your emotional reality. And that questioning is not about resentment, it is about awareness. Their return in that sense becomes less about reunion and more about reflection. It shows you what still pulls you in and what you are no longer willing to tolerate. It reveals whether you still attach meaning to their presence alone or whether you now require emotional consistency to define connection. And even if you still care about them, you may begin to care more about how you feel in the dynamic than about the dynamic itself. This is also where emotional strength becomes quiet but powerful. It is not about shutting down your feelings or pretending you don't care. It is about clear throat, no longer losing yourself inside those feelings. You can acknowledge the connection without abandoning your boundaries. You can feel the pull without letting it override your awareness. You can understand their pattern without becoming emotionally entangled in it. Because at the end of the day, the most important question is not whether they come back again, it is what that cycle is doing to you over time. Does it bring you clarity or confusion? Does it create emotional stability or emotional uncertainty? Does it help you grow or keep you stuck in waiting? And once you start asking those questions honestly, something shifts. The situation is no longer just about their behavior, it becomes about your emotional direction. You begin to see that your life cannot remain paused around someone else's inconsistency. You start recognizing that your emotional energy is valuable and it deserves to be invested in connections that are steady, reciprocal, and clear. That is why this moment is so important, because when an avoidant finally faces you after silence, it is not just their return that matters. It is the version of you that is standing there now after everything you have felt, understood, and endured. And that version of you has choices they didn't have before, choices shaped by experience, not assumption. And in those choices lies your real power, not in waiting, not in guessing, but in deciding what kind of emotional reality you are willing to continue living in.